year after somebody who won the Family Physician of the Year by the college, who's published over 150 peer-reviewed scientific journals. I write poetry, for goodness sake. You know, I grew up in a logging camp in the middle of nowhere. So all of that is to say, folks, you have nothing left to be worried about. Just listen to me, my stories, and forget about any nervousness. You'll all be fabulous. And congratulations for making it this far, folks. Give yourself a round of applause. Fabulous, and I have to say, I'm just so thrilled to have seen a number of folks that I had the pleasure of working with in the NMP. I just have to give a quick shout out to the North, yay for the Northern Medical Program. I also, following up on what Mona said, I would really like to acknowledge that we are in the traditional territories of the Musqueam people. And as somebody who works in the area of Indigenous people's health and well-being, I find that sometimes we increasingly say that, and it's just sort of a flippant statement, and then we move on to the rest of the day, the event, whatever it is that we're moving on to. But I've given it some thought, because I've been a little bit worried at hearing those traditional recognitions over and over again. And I thought, okay, well, what's the other flip side of that? The flip side, of course, is to not bother doing it. And I think that that's more problematic than acknowledging. So I'd just like to, again, and with a great degree of seriousness, acknowledge, as somebody who lives in the North on unceded, untreated territory, to recognize that we are in the traditional territories of the Musqueam people, and that we will, in all of our daily practices, move out into landscapes across this province that are and have always been lived on and inhabited by First Nations people and other Indigenous peoples across the country. So with that, I will tell you too that I don't like PowerPoint slides. I'm a storyteller and poet. So you're going to get precisely 2 slides. You can stare at this one. And then I will have another slide with my email and various Twitter handles and things, so you can follow me at the end of this if you care to. Just under 3 weeks ago, the Huffington Post, a liberal news and commentary outlet that in 2012 became the first commercially run United States digital media enterprise to win a Pulitzer Prize, ran a feature article entitled, "Why We Need the Humanities to Improve Healthcare." According to the article, and in line with a growing body of research and evidence, quote, "The medical humanities help us focus more on meaning-making than on scientific measurement." The article continues, "Telling stories, listening to music, and making and enjoying art, these are human endeavors that affect our emotion and our spirit. They are also the elements that we need to see more of in our healthcare system as it becomes increasingly mechanized. Not everybody knows how to tell a story or how to listen to a story, and many people involved in healthcare may not even think of their patients in terms of the patient's life story. Most physicians are trained to solve medical problems without taking into account the specific psychological and personal histories of a patient, including their underlying values and their spiritual needs." The Huffington Post's article is surprisingly in line with a very, very different text. Rebecca Solnit's 2013 memoir entitled "The Faraway Nearby." The book is as much about losing her mother as it is about the ways that human beings turn to and are connected through the arts and humanities. Stories, writes Solnit, are compasses and architecture. To be without story is to be lost in the vast world that spreads in all directions like Arctic tundra or sea ice. To love someone is to put yourself in their place, which is to put yourself in their story, about how to figure out how you might tell their story, which means that story is place, and stories are geography, and empathy is, first of all, an act of imagination, a storyteller's art, a way of storying and traveling from here to there. I want, with this in mind, to tell you a story. This is a story about stories. One of the story's paths about the importance of stories for human health and well-being, as thought about from the perspectives of some very different storytellers, if we can call an Indigenous author and a radio humorist and an award-winning professor of clinical medicine at the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Columbia University, storytellers, which, for the purpose of this presentation, we will do. One of the stories, the story that I'm about to begin with, is a story about a storyteller who ends up working in a faculty of medicine. A storyteller whose research, broadly speaking, is focused on what continues to be, historically and into today, the single greatest health and well-being gap in British Columbia and beyond. The gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. Put starkly and as an average, according to the BC Provincial Health Officer in 2007, this means that an Indigenous man in British Columbia will die 10 years earlier than a non-Indigenous woman in this province, the population who lives the longest. What does storytelling have to do with this, you might ask? I hope the stories that I'm about to tell you go some measure to providing an answer. Indeed, I hope by the end of this story, you will have some clear ideas about ways to integrate stories in a variety of mediums, and including their tellings, their writings, and even their readings into your practices, research, and education in family medicine. This story starts in a tiny community on 2 islands most people in Canada, indeed most people in the world, will never have heard of, let alone set foot on. If you type the name of these islands into a Microsoft Word document, a red squiggly line is going to appear that tells you you've misspelled something. Haida Gwaii, however, is no spelling error. Haida Gwaii is a fistful of scattered broken bits of earth balanced in mist and alive with the high-pitched whistles of black and white bald eagles, the golden shine of bull kelp on silver sand beaches that stretch as far as the eye can see. It is the ancestral home of the Haida people, people whose connections with the islands have been scientifically dated to reach back more than 7,000 years. People who once spoke to and were spoken to by ravens. As the story goes, and according to one journalist who recently wrote about it, the last of Haida Gwaii's fluent raven speakers passed away fewer than 20 years ago. It made sense, according to the journalist who wrote the story, that the Haida people once spoke fluent raven. In deep history, there would have been more ravens than humans on Haida Gwaii, more ravens roving around the green-gray archipelagos. Ravens are talkative birds, tricksters whose antics were responsible for the first humans on this planet, according to the creation stories told by the Haida. Ravens flew. They flew high. So ravens saw the world in ways that would have proven tremendously helpful to the Haida people so long ago, so long as the Haida people listened to the stories told by ravens. And listen, the Haida people did. They learned from ravens about streams where salmon ran thick. They learned from ravens about the locations of people in danger in the sea. They learned where angry bears might be awakening and where berries were bright and plentiful. It made sense to learn the languages of ravens because ravens had important stories to offer up, stories that would ensure the health of the Haida people, so long as the people listened to raven stories meant, so long as people listened. Raven stories meant prosperity for the Haida people. I grew up on Haida Gwaii. when, in the mid-1980s, at the age of 12 or so, I hit upon what I thought to be a noble and rather original idea that I'd like to help people and make a difference in the world, it made sense in my 12-year-old Haida brain that I would wander down to the largest non-military hospital on Haida. As I wandered down the hill from our house, with ravens calling out lessons that I most certainly did not understand, I daydreamed of the real medical differences that I would soon be making. Things like changing sheets and sitting behind a nursing desk. I would be answering the phone and I would be magically ministering to the sick. I also had visions of my red and white candy-striped uniform. I would quickly and efficiently achieve some sort of Florence Nightingale-esque stature on the Queen Charlotte Islands. Imagine my 12-year-old surprise then when I was greeted at the front door of the small rural hospital by a rather pleasant-looking family physician who said he had the perfect job for young people like myself who wanted to volunteer at a local hospital. There was, he made mention, no need to wear any pretty uniform. My mom's hand-knit sweaters would more than suffice. I could, I was told, sit by Charlotte. I could, I was told, read stories to Charlotte. I could also, although I would likely not understand them, listen to the stories Charlotte would surely tell me, love as she did to tell her stories to young people. Charlotte, you see, was the oldest living Haida human being on the globe. So far as I know, passing away as she did around and about the age of 103, although no one knows for sure when Charlotte was born, she remains one of the longest living Haida people in the knowable present settler colonial history we all live in today. In the weeks and the months during which I sat beside Charlotte in the Queen Charlotte Hospital, some extraordinarily remarkable things happened. Many of them lessons that I still do not understand. Many of them lessons that only show themselves when I least expect it. When I first saw Charlotte, I saw the smallest of bent bodies, a caved-in person with long yellow fingernails and wet, teary eyes, a woman folded slightly into an elevated metal and plastic hospital bed, tucked in with a soft blue blanket. I was terrified. She was so old. 102, the oldest human being I had ever met. I was 12. I overcame my fear and I sat with Charlotte. She held my hand, her hand cool and dry, purple-veined and all bones, curled around mine with a grip I can still recall. She spoke to me slowly and consistently in a language I did not understand. She did not speak English, although she did understand it. During the many, many hours that I sat beside her in that hospital bed, people would come and visit Charlotte. Many of them just stood beside her bed. Some stroked her hair, some fluffed her pillow, or smoothed the blanket over her tiny, tiny body. Often there was silence. Often Charlotte would speak those words I would never understand. Once, a man about the age of my father came in and sat with us. He said to me something that I will never forget. "You are lucky," he said. "You are lucky to be listening to the words of Charlotte. She is a very powerful elder. You do not understand her words, but just listening to her words, her stories, is medicine." Almost 3 decades later, I still carry the stories of Charlotte. My stories of sitting with Charlotte, Charlotte who told me stories that I did not comprehend, which nevertheless settled into me. stories from Haidegwai, stories that frame my position as a teacher and a researcher interested in health inequities, especially in the Northern Medical Program, which is a distributed arm of UBC's Faculty of Medicine. So, are stories medicine? Thomas King, a Cherokee Scottish author of more than 15 books and the mind behind CBC Radio's brilliant Dead Dog Cafe series, thinks so. In his Massey lecture entitled The Truth About Stories, a native narrative, Thomas King writes, quote, that the truth about stories is it is all that we are. King references many other Indigenous storytellers like Jeanette Armstrong, who writes, through my language, through my stories, I understand I am being spoken to. I am not the one speaking. The words are coming from many tongues and many mouths of the Okanagan people and the land around them. Laguna storyteller Leslie Silko is even more direct. She says, stories are not just entertainment. Don't be fooled. They are all we have, you see. They are all we have to fight off illness and to fight off death. If you don't have anything else, you have stories. Some awfully smart non-Aboriginal folks would agree. These folks tell very similar stories, as a matter of fact. They tell their stories in the form of double-blind, peer-reviewed research papers. Some of you might know about Michael Chandler and Chris Lalonde's groundbreaking studies on suicide in First Nations, youth suicide in First Nations communities in BC. Chandler and Lalonde, both with PhDs in psychology, have for the past 2 decades published some of the most groundbreaking investigations about First Nations youth suicide in British Columbia. It seems stories, otherwise called sociocultural resiliency, competency, and continuity, are one of the single greatest preventative hedges against youth suicide in First Nations communities. If young people know their stories, if they're able to tell their own stories, they have better health outcomes. And if youth have better health outcomes, it just might be that the First Nations communities that experience the greatest burdens of poor health in the province will grow into healthier communities tomorrow. Dr. Rita Sharon, founder and director of the Center for Narrative Medicine at Columbia University, would also likely not disagree that stories are important. The basic premise of Sharon's work, I always mispronounce her name. The basic premise of Sharon's work, articulated a little differently than Thomas King, Michael Chandler, or Chris Lalonde, is that narratives shared between physicians or other healthcare professionals and narratives shared between healthcare professionals and their patients afford unique ways of navigating the most fundamental aspects of the human condition: suffering, pain, joy, fear, connection, transformation, terror, illness, passing on, and love, to name but a few. Sharon argues that narrative is the most basic scaffolding of any story, because narrative is a retelling, a description, a relating of events in a sequential and relational way, as opposed to speaking in isolated or staccato ways about various facets of illness and wellness. Story, then, that arc, that narrative connection of points, is fundamental to meaningful clinical encounters. Narrative or story allows for humans to truly understand each other. They increase the capacity to deepen diagnostics, increasing an empathetic orientation to complex medical challenges, increase the likelihood of a successful doctor-patient relationship. The telling and the reading and the consumption of stories, according to Sharon and her team, is not unidirectional. It's not just about getting patients to tell their stories to healthcare professionals. Instead, stories are bilateral narratives. They're multi-directional tools that allow healthcare professionals to critically reflect on our own practices by understanding events relationally, over time, across different spaces and across multiple geographies. They allow us to effectively communicate about this is a term I only recently learned from my graduate students. They allow us to effectively communicate about the wickedly complex problems that are so often involved in clinical interaction. Reading stories, and remember, this doesn't need to be stories that are in any way, shape, or form clearly about health or medical practices, is also therapeutic unto itself. It allows us to visualize new modes of human interaction, to see things unfolding in unexpected ways. It allows us to probe our own realities deeply and in complex ways that might not otherwise be considered. In short, stories, narratives, are a remarkable phenomena that expand our capacities to understand ourselves and those with whom we live, with whom we share the reality of this human condition. Stories are us as we tell them, as they are told to us. How then to integrate stories and art into family practice research and education associated with what all of you folks are going out into the world to do? If we understand stories fundamentally as a narrative art, which certainly in great part they are, a recent book by Alain de Bottin and John Armstrong might offer some insights. Art as therapy suggests that stories and art and narratives are a tool. Like other tools, stories and art have, according to the authors, quote, the power to extend our capacities beyond those that nature originally endowed us with. Like a knife is a response to our need, but our inability to cut, stories and art are tools that, through at least 7 functions, can help guide and counsel humans to become better versions of ourselves. Art and stories assist us in remembering. They assist us in preserving experiences for critical reflection, or simply to preserve details that we wouldn't otherwise have the capacity to hold in our head. They can help us maintain hope. They can be a light during a bleak or a hopeless time. Art and stories are a tool to navigate sorrow. They guide us in how to suffer more successfully, in a more dignified way, by providing broader vantage points than we're able to achieve on our own. They point out the ways that others before us and possibly after us have suffered as well. Art and stories can assist in rebalancing, in putting us in touch with concentrated doses of our missing dispositions in order to reestablish equilibrium in ourselves. And they can enhance thus our own self-understanding by providing a kind of mirror to to our intuitions, our hunches, our suspicions, our musings, the part of ourselves we might not fully understand, but can, through stories, find presented back to ourselves, returned to us, so that we can know ourselves all the better. Finally, stories and art can stimulate growth and deepen our appreciation of the here and the now. If we confront our fears in the form of art or in the form of story, things that make us uncomfortable, we might be able to grapple with those uncomfortable making things and the threats that we perceive in them and have it reflected back to us. If we actively engage stories and art, they become a resource that leads us back to a more accurate assessment of who we truly are and what we truly value. Stories allow us to recalibrate what we admire, what we fear, and what we love. Stories exist all around us, in mediums too great to enumerate here. If we truly want to teach ourselves about worlds beyond our own, and thus also about ourselves and the way that we relate to our own and to other worlds, there may be no better place to start than with novels, with short stories, movies, poems, plays, or essays. If you for a moment worry you do not fully understand the worlds and realities of Indigenous peoples and patients in Canada, read Drew Hayden Taylor, read Maria Campbell, Joseph Boyden, Jeanette Armstrong, Thomas King, Jordan Abel, Lee Miracle, David Daniel Moses, or Gregory Schofield. Read all of them and read more. Watch a documentary by Warren Carreyrou, or sit down in front of Artanajuat, the fast runner, and learn about myriad of Indigenous stories in this country. Look for stories and undertake, relevant to today, undertake storied methodologies and pedagogies in your research and in your teaching. There are tools like autoethnography, critical reflection, and biographic narrative interpretive method. These are all increasingly meeting with success as viable and productive tools by which to create and disseminate knowledge. And the creation and the dissemination of knowledge is at the heart of research, education, and healthcare. Ultimately, however, remember that stories might be spoken to you in Raven or in Haida, or by many, many others whose words you will not, may not ever fully understand in the moment. It is still vital that you listen. Listen carefully, because, as Thomas King reminds us, the truth about stories is that it's all we are. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I had to fight back tears quite a few times. We've now got our summer reading list and movie list. So I'm just so grateful to Sarah for coming and sharing this. And we have a small token of our appreciation, which we hope you'll enjoy. And
it's probably not a story, because stories can't be put in boxes.
It's actually to do with salads. Yeah. I hope you like salads. This morning. She may be able to come to visit some of the presentations, so if anybody has any questions. But plus you have contact information, and also I'm sure some of us would like that reading list, so maybe we could have, you've got handouts.
Yes, I have
handouts.
Part of this talk was just recently published in the Journal of Canadian Family Physicians, so it's right here, and you can look at some of the references and some of the discussion that I made reference to.
And I should also plug, obviously, the first-year residents who are thinking about what am I going to do for my project. Obviously, Sarah would be a good resource if you're interested in any of those fancy new methodologies, storytelling.
And also outside, there's an issue of a journal that I had the utter pleasure of co-editing with about 15 fairly prestigious Indigenous authors across the country. So if you just want quick and easy and fabulous access to remarkable Indigenous visual arts, poetry, fiction, and reflections on documentary films, please help yourself to a copy of that journal right outside the door. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So I have some announcements to make before we head in.